You don't have a right to security from the harm people cause you by saying and supporting things that you find absolutely vile and horrific.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli, henceforth Alex H. I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil, as per usual. George Hoare is in London. Hello, George.
Hey, I'm always the only George, so I don't have to be George. I mean, George
You're George
H.
as well, yeah.
I mean, I guess the H, it doesn't stand for henceforth in your case, but that would be a good name, Alex Henceforth. I think I think you should rebrand as that.
I like that. I might use that as a pseudonym. And Alex Gourevitch, henceforth Alex G, contributing editor to this podcast, is joining us from, and I always forget where you're calling.
I'm in Cambridge,
Massachusetts. Yep. Yeah, because there's two Cambridges. There's one on the other side of the pond, as they call
Indeed.
it too. Anyway, both university towns, and that is very much to the point of what we're going to be talking about today. We've invited Alex on to discuss together a lot of the issues brought up in his excellent article, The Right to be Hostile, which came out in Boston Review very recently and is linked to in the show notes. It is a defense of the right to protest and free expression in light of repression of both of these, especially on college campuses, and in particular in relation to demonstrations regarding Israel and Palestine. So this is a matter which listeners might remember that we've discussed before. Exactly a year and 1 month ago, an episode 409 came out on the 7th of May, 2024, on Palestine protests and repression. Back then, we discussed it in relation to Columbia University in New York calling the cops on the students. And we want to catch up on the story since then. As we noted a year or so ago, universities are ever more consumerized, even when they're public institutions, and by consequence more surveilled, and the relationship between administrators and students ever more authoritarian. And in that episode, Phil gave some great examples from the University of Kent also, and how this has played out. I was re-listening to that episode, and he told the story about how the university had allowed licensing, they allowed alcoholic beverages to be sold on campus, and it made that seemingly perverse move as a means to make it more easy to call the cops to intervene. And I think that's just one little example, but quite telling. This is a new McCarthyism, as Alex Gourevitch calls it, in his really excellent article. And even if you're listening to this, I encourage you, listener, to go and read it afterwards. As Alex notes in the article, universities have forsaken institutional neutrality in favor of increasingly vocal social justice liberalism. And this has had perverse effects, which we're going to go on to discuss. So in this episode, firstly, we will catch up with what's happened over the past year on the U.S. university campuses and beyond. We'll talk about the way that university administrators have been complicit with repression on campus. We'll talk about the role of the university and how to defend civil liberties, the role of public and private. And then we'll finish off by talking about anti-Semitism, about Israel, and why the authorities have chosen Israel as the hill to die on. And maybe some stuff about the 1960s, the university protest, and how to understand that in historical perspective. So to begin and to bring Alex G in, if he wouldn't mind catching us up on the last year or so, not just what's happened at Columbia, but across universities and indeed maybe American society as a whole.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, since you did that episode a year ago, the most obvious and important change was Donald Trump's election. And he has done what I think he's done more than most people expected to directly intervene in and try to discipline and control institutions of higher education. So the most important features of his election have, with respect to kind of the right to protest and free speech on campus anyhow, has been the way in which, even though the protests were already rolled up protesters arrested by cops and campus security, encampments destroyed by the time he took office. Trump then engaged in a pretty extensive policy of discipline over the universities. His two major tools have been immigration policy and federal funding. And he has basically withheld billions of dollars in federal funding from about 60 colleges and universities. If they do any kind of, on a number of grounds, all of them ideological grounds. So if they run afoul of any of his particular culture wars against gender ideology or DEI or environmentalism, then he's withholding the funds, and it's billions of dollars. I mean, these are massive blows to the annual operating budget to these universities, and they're all currently in the process of, and will be even more in the process of, having to tighten their belts quite severely, in many cases possibly more severely than universities had to do after the great financial crisis. But the most important, for the purposes of this podcast, kind of ideological use of federal funding has been in the name of fighting anti-Semitism on campus. And so he has withheld billions of dollars from universities that he accuses of having an anti-Semitism problem, and is going much further, actually, than just, demanding new rules against protesters. He's really aggressively expanded and tried to institutionalize the viewpoint, the kind of the anti-Israel viewpoint, by demanding all kinds of changes in the way certain universities, especially Columbia and Harvard, but others clearly understand that they're in line next, changing the way they do hiring, the way they do their curricula, the way they do their disciplinary procedures. So unlike other situations where some protests have been kind of stopped or limited, this is the attempt to create an entire new regime for protest and speech and academic inquiry on campus. The other tool that Trump has used to try to intimidate and cow people on campus has been immigration policy. And anyone reading any news knows that it's not just been sort of the most notable participants in protests like Mohammed Khalil, but a Tufts student who wrote an op-ed, didn't participate in any protest, was arrested and disappeared on the streets by masked ICE agents. Various, like a cancer researcher or affiliated with a university at a hospital, they were stopped, they were arrested, they were sent away. In many cases, it appears that they've been using AI to search through the entire online presence of anyone who's a non-citizen, and then detain them if anything comes up that's suspicious at all. This happened for a scholar at Yale who actually was accused by an AI-written article. It wasn't written by a human being. It's a website that Haaretz had revealed previously to be basically AI-generated content, and the AI accused the scholar at Yale of being pro-Hamas, and in virtue of that alone, Yale then fired the scholar.
Jesus.
And so there's all kinds of incidents like this where
that's like extremely dystopian, and like most
Totally.
believable dystopias, incredibly stupid at the same time.
And even though the Yale General Counsel was informed of the fact that the only evidence was this one AI article, they put the scholar on administrative leave and then forced her out without any real ability to appeal. So, and the Trump administration's leaned on precedent as well as its own executive orders to basically say that it can engage in viewpoint-based discrimination against non-citizens to deport them on the grounds that so long as they take what the person said to be hostile to American, to be a danger to American national security interests, they can be deported. And it's unfortunately, or detained by ICE agents and then deported or whatever. So it's very likely that will hold up in court, actually. And then the final thing they've done is just revoked international student visas for all Harvard students, for a large swath of other students, um, on the grounds that they're a national security threat, or we shouldn't be giving foreign students positions in American universities to begin with. That, again, is a much more sweeping thing than just going after people for having expressed any critical views of American policy or Israel. But the kind of initial wedge in was to attack universities for being anti-Semitic or not protecting the civil rights of their Jewish and Israeli students on the grounds that it permitted these protests, and claiming that there were large numbers of non-citizens who were in the U.S. at universities, endangering American national security or being anti-Semitic. So, and that's had an enormous chilling effect on campus. I know personally of people who are afraid to say things because they just don't know. I mean, AI has actually changed the game a bit here, because you can give it search terms and search requirements, and it can just generate all kinds of things off people's social media feeds. There's now directives that if someone deleted their social media accounts prior to coming to the US, that immediately is a sign of suspicion, and they probably won't be allowed in. So anyhow, this kind of stuff, which is mainly the coercive use of immigration powers and federal funding, has really put universities in an incredible bind, because much of it is technically legal, even in some cases when it's not viewpoint neutral. So when it's just going after people for express certain kinds of views. Most American universities have somewhere between 10 to 30% of their student faculty population is a non-citizen. So it means the intellectual and academic life of these universities is really being threatened, because if that number of people feels afraid to say something because they're afraid they're going to get deported, you can't have a normal free exchange of ideas. And of course, a lot of the protests a lot of universities have now sort of preemptively or proactively rewritten their protest rules to make it much harder, or increase the punishments, or narrow the conditions under which you can protest, in light of the expected intervention by the federal government. And I have to say, universities did not, in most cases, universities have not sort of plumbed the outer limits of what they could do to defend their students. But it does have to be said that the amount of pressure, coercive pressure coming from the federal government is extraordinary. And I can't think of a time since the McCarthy period when there has been such intense control over universities, and notably over private elite universities, since the targeted ones are those universities.
I wanted to ask whether you were surprised by this, because I certainly, following it, have been kind of shocked by it. And it's also interesting to note how, when we were talking about this a year ago, and it was still under the Biden presidency, that was seen, and indeed Columbia in New York, it's a Democratic mayor, mostly Democratic city, right? And that we even speculated, I think, or Phil speculated in that episode about the role that municipal politics might play, and the role of a city which is quite heavily Jewish relative to the rest of the country, etc. And so you'd think, well, the Republicans are in power at the federal level now, that might swing back the other way, or I don't know, something else might happen. And instead, it's just kind of intensified. So have you been taken aback by this?
I have been surprised by just how aggressive and expansive Trump's reaction was. I thought that what he was going to do was empower people like Chris Rufo to kind of run their plagiarism checks and constantly harass elite professors and, play a kind of right-wing populist game of constantly antagonizing and criticizing, especially elite universities, and, kind of making class war into culture war. But I did not anticipate that he would engage in such the amount of kind of financial warfare that he is doing. The immigration stuff doesn't wholly surprise me, but the financial warfare aspect does was a bit of a surprise, just because of the scope of it and how much damage it will do just to kind of basic scientific inquiry at these universities, because a huge amount of basic science research is done in the US through these universities. Even in private universities are sort of public contractors, as we've learned. So that part has surprised me. It's also surprised me that he continues to dial up this kind of flood the zone strategy, which he's taken in other areas. It has been relentless. And
Can you explain what that is, actually, for those who don't know?
well, it's a strategy promoted by people like Bannon, which is that for every issue, you just constantly engage in a series of actions, and you engage in a series of actions or interventions, be they executive orders or policy changes or funding withholding, and you do it simultaneously across a large number of issues. So you do your climate policy and your tariff policy and your immigration policy and your tax policy and your foreign policy all at once. And by flooding the zone with action day in, day out, with new initiatives across all these issues, you make it impossible for anyone to keep up.
Right.
And so even if you overstep, and you overstep a bunch of different times, you still get a lot of what you want, even when it's not legal in some cases, because it's just impossible it's impossible to organize resistance when you're just kind of treading water in response. And that has kind of been the situation with the universities. So, I mean, just last week, there was a new executive order, I think, regarding foreign students. He's recently announced the cancellation of all student visas for Harvard students for the next year. So they're all going to have to leave. That was a new thing in response to Harvard refusing to buckle to Trump's demands on Harvard as a condition where it may be receiving its funding back from the government. So I have been surprised by the relentlessness. It's not exactly seeing it through. It's not exactly consistent, but unlike the first Trump term, he's been willing to do a lot more that's much more coercive, that crosses lines, that's going to upset judges who are going to have to roll these things back, but that process is slow. So yeah, I was caught off guard by this, genuinely caught off guard by its scope, by the scale, by the severity.
So I guess I wanted to ask a question about which I think follows on from this. Hearing you talk about this, one thing which definitely came to mind is the extent to which, I don't know how I'd put this, universities might have brought this on themselves to a certain extent, or haven't really defended kind of academic freedom or freedom of speech or the right to protest in a way
Right.
that could have made things a little bit different. And so and again, I'll repeat Alex's comments on the Boston Review, the right to be hostile piece, which was from the 6th of May. You know, I think it is an account of some of the ways that university administrators themselves have undermined the right to protest. And
Yeah.
so maybe could you just talk listeners through this a little bit? Because you basically say there are these three kind of reasons, and one of them is the worst of the three. And I obviously have some follow-up questions on this, but
Sure.
I think it's probably better to let you explain the argument of your essay rather than me doing it for you.
No, sure. So the point of the essay, I started writing that essay before Trump took office, and I had to constantly edit and change it as the kind of new regime came in, and I saw the scope of it and how much he was taking up and extending complaints that the Biden administration had endorsed and that had been voluntarily acted on by universities during the protests in 2024. And so the argument of the piece really starts from the premise: why is it that the left suddenly found itself facing repression of protests in the name of arguments that the left itself had spent the previous couple decades promoting? And therefore, why did liberals in the left find themselves politically weak in the face of these repressions? And some of it has to do with the peculiarities of the Israel-Palestine issue, which is sort of polarizing in a special way and divides differently from other issues. but there were deeper foundations for it. And protest is an especially important or sort of exemplary instance for understanding sort of how chickens came home to roost, because the basic point I make in the article is that protests aren't just like ordinary speech. Protests are public and disruptive collective acts that tend almost always to involve hostility, the expression of hostility to the views and the policies that you're criticizing. Many other kinds of speech aren't like that, or they aren't quite so intense and hostile. And that public hostility tends to produce reactions in other people in a way many other kinds of speech don't. So protests are a real test of the kinds of principles that are determining sort of when we think it's permissible to intervene in or defend people's speech rights, and when we think other things are more important. So in light of that, I thought it was interesting at how weak the left was. And I don't think it was just because the left has sort of generically kind of wobbled over the past 10, 20 years, or done more than wobbled on whether free speech is a principle or not. I think anyone paying attention knows that the left was kind of generally hostile to free speech absolutists. I certainly know it because it was a position I've held for a long time and faced privately and publicly criticism for it. But there were as you mentioned, three things that universities and the towns around them and students and faculty within it raised to justify limiting these protests, since the protests were comprehensively nonviolent, but public and hostile. Right. The two most comprehensive studies of these shows that they were overwhelmingly nonviolent forms of public protest. So the first thing was that protests are disruptive and they get in the way of the ordinary functioning of the academy. The second was that the protesters were effectively trespassing, at least whenever they were engaged in encampments that hadn't been approved or were suddenly said not to be approved by the university. And then the third, and this is the bit that's most important, was that protests were taken either to be harmful or creating a hostile environment or constituted a form of harassment. And these kinds of things kind of intersected. And the piece kind of goes through all three of them, but the most important argument to my mind was the third one. So I'll just, people are interested in the first two, they can read the piece, but I think the most important from our standpoint,
I agree,
is how the right to protest is really incompatible with certain ways of thinking about harm and vulnerability and harassment that have developed especially extensively on college campuses. And it was really striking to see this stuff in the kind of public complaints by the students and the Jewish organizations and the pro-Israel organizations that were bringing this up. And the argument went something like this. Either protests were themselves threatening. They involved threats to Jewish or Israeli or any kind of pro-Israel people on campus, just in virtue of involving the expressions they did, like from the river to the sea or globalize the Intifada. So that was taken to be a threat to the individuals there, or it was taken to be harassment of them on the basis of their identity as Jews or Israelis. Or, and this was really the kind of claim that really pulled everything together, which was that they constituted a hostile environment because they generated feelings of vulnerability and insecurity in the people who were hearing or witnessing the protests. And a lot of testimony was presented in official, in these reports by, like, I quote extracts from the Harvard Jewish Alumni Association report. There was a recently released set of studies. Columbia released one. Harvard did another report on anti-Semitism on campus. And, it would include examples like someone at a library felt unsafe because there were students with keffiyehs in the library talking about writing an op-ed. or somebody would wake up and feel triggered, that's a direct quotation, just hearing the chants and protests of the protesters outside. And the important thing about this was that because they felt that way, that was taken as a reason to think a hostile environment really had been created, that anything that generating these feelings of vulnerability or insecurity had constituted a form of harassment or discrimination against students on the basis of their identity, in this case as Jews or pro-Israel Jews, and that therefore Harvard had a legal obligation to protect these students from anything that caused these feelings of vulnerability. And of course, this form of argument, even when you take out the kind of civil rights angle, there's in the US, there's a special aspect of it, which is if Harvard or any institution fails to protect any group that feels like they can't participate as equals in virtue of being targeted as a group, it's a civil rights violation. So a lot of lawsuits were filed against these universities for civil rights violations under Title VI. These Title VI proceedings is the legal kind of category. But even if you take out that civil rights thing, we can come back to it another point. The key thought was that Harvard as an institution was being anti-Semitic, or it was failing to guarantee the security of its students, because just what it is to guarantee security is to guarantee people from ever having to feel insecure. So I said, what was going on here was that the right to be safe was being converted into a right to feel safe. And that idea that the obligation of the university is to police the activities of all its members to make sure that nobody feels safe is a very familiar kind of argument from the last 20, 30 years of identity politics and culture wars, promoted as much or more by the left. And that was what was so interesting to me, was that the structure of the language, that we have to honor the subjective feelings of the people who feel feared because they know what oppression is, and if the oppressed know what the oppression is, and only they can. So you can't question, say, Jews when you say, actually, this isn't anti-Semitic, it's a form of political criticism or something like that. In virtue of feeling that way, they are effectively unsafe, and there's a political obligation by the authorities to punish anyone who makes them feel safe. And that this right to feel safe overrides the normal civil liberties of everybody else. So people don't get to claim they have a civil liberty to say free speech or freely associate and protest if it causes other people to feel vulnerable. And then alongside that was people claiming they just are being harmed. The very fact of having to hear it is harming them because it just causes them distress and trauma. So that angle so it's either it's causing harm or it's harassment of them on the basis of identity, or, and this is sort of the bedrock thought, it causes people feelings of insecurity. And when they feel insecure, they don't feel like they can participate. And therefore, you've got to first police everyone's civil liberties until those other people can reassure everyone else that they're not going to exercise those civil liberties in ways that make other people feel unsafe. Since that's impossible, it just means you get a very authoritarian way of exercising the administrative power of the university, and eventually the police get called in as well.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gourevitch, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.